I returned from New Jersey. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss The Time Machine, chapters 7 through 9. This is where the novel suddenly gets really dark. The time traveler's understanding of the future changes again. He's figured out that continued capitalist exploitation has led to the gradual evolution of two new human species. The wealthy evolved into the frail and childlike Eloi, who live above ground as a kind of decrepit aristocracy, and workers evolved into the small, furry Morlocks, who live in factories deep underground, manufacturing goods for the Eloi. The time traveler assumed that the two new species had evolved so completely that they were content in their respective roles and environments. That appears to have been the case for a while, but things changed further, and I now understood, to some slight degree at least, the reason of the fear of the little upper-world people for the dark. I wondered vaguely what foul villainy it might be that the Morlocks did under the new moon. I felt pretty sure now that my second hypothesis was all wrong. The upperworld people might once have been the favored aristocracy, and the Morlocks their mechanical servants, but that had long since passed away. The two species that had resulted from the evolution of man were sliding down towards, or had already arrived at, an altogether new relationship. The new relationship between the Eloi and Morlocks is nightmarish. And then I thought once more of the meat that I had seen. I felt assured now of what it was, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied this last feeble rill from the great flood of humanity. Clearly, at some time in the long ago of human decay, the Morlocks' food had run short. These Eloi were mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon, probably saw to the breeding of. The Morlocks once worked for the Eloi, but now the Eloi have become the Morlocks' food. If the Morlocks continue to produce goods for the Eloi, it's to keep them healthy and in good enough shape to eat. This horrifies the time traveler, though I wonder if we see here a warning from Wells, who was, as I've mentioned, a critic of capitalism. Workers cannot be exploited forever. They won't let themselves be, and it won't end well for the wealthy. What's harder for me to understand is the time traveler's attitude to the relationship between the Eloi and the Morlocks. Although the time traveler at first feels alienated from both the Eloi and the Morlocks, once he discovers that the Morlocks eat the Eloi, he definitively takes the Eloi's side. I tried to preserve myself from the horror that was coming upon me by regarding it as a rigorous punishment of human selfishness. Man had been content to live in ease and delight upon the labors of his fellow man, had taken necessity as his watchword and excuse, and in the fullness of time necessity had come home to him. I even tried a Carlyle-like scorn of this wretched aristocracy in decay. But this attitude of mine was impossible. However great their intellectual degradation, the Eloi had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy, and to make me perforce a sharer in their degradation and their fear. The time traveler tries to see justice in the revenge of the Morlocks against the Eloi. Apparently for thousands of years the Eloi exploited the Morlocks, forced the Morlocks to do difficult and dangerous work underground so that they could live lives of ease. The time traveler tries to tell himself the Eloi had this coming, and yet he can't embrace that position. This makes psychological sense. As he notes, the Eloi look more human than the Morlocks, and that resemblance instinctively draws the time traveler to them. And he's also spent more time with the Eloi, and made friends with one of them, Weena. But the time traveler's fear of the Morlocks becomes a hatred that is frightening. In the abandoned museum that he refers to as the Palace of Green Porcelain, the time traveler feels, here I was more in my element, for rising on either side of me were the huge bulks of big machines, all greatly corroded and many broken down, but some still fairly complete. You know I have a certain weakness for mechanism, and I was inclined to linger among these. The more so as for the most part they had the interest of puzzles, and I could make only the vaguest guesses at what they were for. I fancied that if I could solve their puzzles, I should find myself in possession of powers that might be of use against the Morlocks. The time traveler fantasizes about using old machines as weapons against the Morlocks, about declaring war on the Morlocks. He later admits that he feels bloodthirsty toward them. I had judged the strength of the lever pretty correctly, for it snapped after a minute's strain, and I rejoined her with a mace in my hand, more than sufficient, I judged, for any Morlock skull I might encounter. and I longed very much to kill a Morlock or so. Very inhuman, you may think, to want to go killing one's own descendants. But it was impossible, somehow, to feel any humanity in the things. Only my disinclination to leave Weena, and a persuasion that if I began to slake my thirst for murder my time machine might suffer, restrained me from going straight down the gallery and killing the brutes I heard. Hating the Morlocks is one thing. It's another to struggle to restrain oneself from bashing their skulls in. After the death of Weena, his hostility against the Morlocks becomes almost megalomaniacal. I searched again for traces of Weena, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. I cannot describe how it relieved me to think that it had escaped the awful fate to which it seemed destined. As I thought of that, I was almost moved to begin a massacre of the helpless abominations about me, but I contained myself. This passage I actually find really disturbing. The time traveler wants to commit a massacre of the Morlocks. He wants to engage in really what we could call a kind of genocide. Although the world presented in this book appears to be a future that H.G. Wells thought was possible, H.G. Wells is not the time traveler, and we can't assume that the thoughts and beliefs the time traveler has are also those of H.G. Wells. I'm not sure what reaction Wells wants us to have to these violent desires of the time traveler. The time traveler is the narrator and protagonist of most of the novel, but I'm not confident we can call him the hero of the book. I'm not confident that Wells likes the time traveler. The time traveler at least seems to embody some of human beings' worst impulses. The time traveler might be, along with the Eloi and the Morlocks, yet another example of the human tendencies for violence and conflict and tribalism. So the time machine might begin as a fun science fiction adventure, but it seems to me to become something quite different. It turns into a very dark and disturbing book, arguably a really cynical and even misanthropic one. But the book is going to change yet again. The remaining few chapters feature further time travel into the future. These last chapters are my favorite in the novel. They're really smart, I think, but they're also very weird and unsettling, and they'll lead to the book's final and most dramatic shift in perspective.